Welcome to episode 444 of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview David Roche. David is a running coach and trail runner, and he recently broke the long-standing Leadville 100 course record in his first 100-mile race, taking down a record previously thought unbreakable. In this episode, he sheds light on everything that went into this course record, including things like training, race strategy, nutrition, and various marginal gains. I wanted to have David on when I heard about the level of detailed thinking and planning that went into this performance, because I think to some level this is applicable to every single endurance athlete trying to achieve an ambitious goal, no matter what the level of the athlete is. I also have for a long time been interested in the crossover of knowledge and training and racing strategies between ultra running and Ironman or full distance triathlon in general. And this is something that we discussed to some extent as well within this interview. As you will hear, David's Leadville time was 15 hours and 26 minutes. So for a lot of people, this is in the same ballpark as an Ironman finishing time. And this is why I think that there's just a lot to learn and lots of potential knowledge transfer between these sports. And it's something that David has the same thoughts about, and he will get onto it in the interview, but he has applied things commonly done in triathlon and cycling to improve his running. And I think that that's quite enough for an introduction, but I just wanted to give a bit of a short explanation as for why I think this is an episode that should be interesting for every endurance athlete, no matter if you have any interest in ultra running or trail running or not. I think there are still some really interesting takeaways here for any endurance athlete, especially if you're doing kind of long endurance events, like let's say Ironman. Now, just a very quick housekeeping item. We have opened registrations for a training camp in the Algarve in Portugal from the 26th of April to the 3rd of May in 2025. So this camp is in addition to our camp in Mallorca, which takes place a few weeks earlier. We have limited availability for the camp in Portugal, so it's best to register quickly for it to guarantee your slot. And I have links to both camps in the episode description, or you can just go to scientifictriathlon.com and find them directly there. Now, finally, before we get into the interview, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration. They create fueling products and electrolytes, and in this episode there is a pretty funny moment, to me at least, where David, not knowing that they are a sponsor, really raves about them, and specifically about how some of the information and data that they have on hydration have contributed to his fueling and hydration strategy, that by running standards at least was pretty extreme. And something that I don't remember at this moment is if we talked about caffeine, but I know from having heard or read about it elsewhere that within David's record, he used an extreme amount of Precision Fuel caffeine gels. So these are gels that have 100 milligrams of caffeine. And I cannot remember the exact numbers, but basically he really pushed the limits in terms of caffeine intake, and it seems to have worked really well for him. And this is something that I personally have also found in races, that bumping up my intake of caffeine through the Precision Fuel caffeine gels has seemed to help with race performance. If you want to stock up on super high quality fueling products or electrolytes, you can get 15% off your first order of Precision Fuel Hydration by using the code TTS24 on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And thank you to Senate. The Senate Indoor Swim Trainer is a dryland swim bench that allows you to improve your technique, power, and swim training consistency. For a lot of athletes, the limitation to swim training is the time commitment, especially for those living further away from the pool. If you need a 2 to 2.5 hour time window to be able to swim for 60 minutes, then it can make it very difficult to swim more than once or twice per week, because finding such a time window in a busy schedule is quite the challenge for most of us. And if you're in this situation where you're restricted on how much you can swim, then you can use the Senate to complement your pool swimming with quick and efficient home-based workouts that challenge the swim-specific muscles, including core strength and stability, and give yourself a chance to keep improving your swimming even when you have limited time in the water. You can try the Senate risk-free for 30 days and get 20% off your first order on senateswimtrainer.com/TTS. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with David Roche. Welcome to That Triathlon Show, David. How are you doing?
Thank you so much for having me. This is so cool. I get to talk to tons of triathletes, a sport that I love and respect so much. Like, we're going to get into a lot on here, the Leadville 100 and different things I did and logistics and all of that. But every triathlon has like 1,000 times more of these questions, given that it's spread across 3 sports, the training discipline, the racing approach, all of that. So I learn a lot from triathlon, and I can't wait to chat.
Yeah, I had a discussion last year, I think, around UTMB with how in trail ultra running, the aid station process has become so refined over a few years, and somebody who is more into the trail running space than I am said that actually some of them are really taking a page out of the book of triathlon, really, with transitions and stuff. So I think there's a lot of overlap, and that's why I want to have this interview between trail ultra running and triathlon, and especially Ironman triathlon, or the Ironman distance, full distance triathlon. But let's back up a bit and start with an introduction for those not familiar with you. Can you tell us a bit more about yourself and who you are?
I'm David Roche. I'm a coach primarily. That's the main way my identity, I think, would be known more publicly. And just recently, Leadville launched me onto the scene a lot more for a lot of people as an athlete, though I've been going as hard as I can for 18 years now in training, actually starting with duathlon, starting as a cyclist and then eventually transitioning over, still do a lot of biking. But yeah, so I've coached tons of athletes who have won some of the biggest running races in the world, from Western States to CCC, Hard Rock, all that good stuff, Leadville. Then also, athletes that have won world championships and things like that. So the cool thing for me is, as a coach of top level athletes and athletes of all levels, and then also as an athlete, like, I'm getting to pilot things for myself rather than having to be a mad scientist as a coach. I can always be trying to be ahead of the curve as an athlete, finding out what works and what doesn't for me, which is obviously just an N=1, but that N=1 then helps inform me as how I talk about everything else. Like, we'll get into some of those details, I'm sure, with things like ketones and bicarb, but also things I don't do, like creatine and double threshold, and how that influences how I think about the sport generally.
Yeah, no, that's a great overview. And coming back to your background as a coach, or your role as a coach, your job as a coach and identity as a coach, I believe that before you were a coach, or maybe in parallel, but you have a background in some environmental law or something to that effect. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I went to law school, was never thinking about being a coach. And then in 2013, 2014, Megan, my wife, who's a brilliant doctor, PhD, and now I think one of the best coaches in the world, herself, far better coach than anyone I've ever seen, she was like, David, you should really think about coaching. So I was a public interest environmental lawyer working with communities, and she just saw something in me that I didn't have the courage to see myself. And so, yeah, I mean, dipped my toes into coaching while I was still doing law, and did that for years, where coaching was something that I would do before work, during lunch, after work. And then eventually Megan convinced me, David, just go all in, take the dive. And yeah, it took off in ways I never could expect. It's maybe the most fulfilling professional thing I could ever imagine.
Yeah. And were you, in terms of your own athletic career, can you tell us a bit more about that? You said that you've been going at it full tilt for 18 years, starting as a duathlete. So tell us more about that.
Yeah. So I went to college here at 17, 18 years old to be an American football player. So I was a big guy. I was very strong. I was like 50 or 60 pounds heavier than I am now. And then quit that sport when I kind of realized that college football wasn't for me, and wanted to get into endurance athletics. It's always what I dreamed of, because my dad had been a cyclist when I was growing up, and I grew up watching the Tour de France, the little recaps of 30 minutes that were on in the US. And so I started biking, and I biked for about a year after that. And like a lot of cyclists that don't have the best bike handling, I had power, but got in a lot of crashes, and realized I probably shouldn't be doing this at the top level. Plus, I had an understanding then that as I tried to learn about training theory, cycling at the top level, which is what I wanted to do. I wanted to do whatever I did, and I wanted to focus on it and be good eventually. It required such a quantity of training that I wasn't going to be able to do it in the context of my life, with my goals in the future professionally, which at the time was, helping to save the world, or whatever people say when they're getting into those types of jobs. So I started running, and from there, it was just a slow build-up process. I mean, my talent is not the type of talent that shows up right away, ever. And I think a lot of the times all the stories of people that achieve these wild things, it's almost always like, and then they were great right away. My journey was always, and it took him 5 years to find out that he's good. And then 5 years after that, he became great. And so got into short distance trail running over time, eventually got into longer distance, but I didn't even do my first race over 50K until last year at 35 years old.
Yeah, well, and we'll get onto that, but Leadville was your first 100-mile race, so
Yeah.
debut at the distance and a
Yeah.
cracking
And
one.
I never finished above, I finished 250 milers that went both very well. Never finished 100K. Or I mean, I finished 100K, but one of them I blew up, other 100K I DNF. So, yeah, it was truly taking a big old shot.
Yeah, yeah. I actually forgot to check this before, but I was going to check what the median finishing time for an Ironman is, because I have a
Yeah.
feeling that it's probably somewhere around 14 hours or so, and maybe 13 to 14 hours. And your finishing time in Leadville was 15. You have to help me here,
26.
26. So actually, it's a 100 miler at your speed. Obviously, that's the very fastest speed, but that's very comparable to what a lot of people do for the duration for an Ironman. So again, just one of the reasons that I wanted to have this interview, because I find so many fascinating crossovers between the two sports. But tell us more, and especially considering that perhaps a lot of listeners might not know so much about treadmill running and races like Leadville. Can you tell us more about that race, the race course, the previous course record, and the background, and then we get into how you went about targeting that record and then setting the record.
So Leadville is one of the more preeminent ultra races in the world. It kind of started it all along with Western states here in the US, where when I first got into running back in 2007, 2008, I remember reading Anton Krupicka's blog, this famous ultra runner, talking about how he would do 200-mile weeks for Leadville. And then in the book Born to Run, the Leadville 100 was such a huge part of that book and captured the world's imagination, as they even talked about the course record held by Matt Carpenter, who is one of the best athletes of all time. His VO2 max was measured in Italy at 94.9. So he's a mountain runner without much match in history, not just in running, but in almost anything else. And so as I thought about taking this leap into 100 miles, which I know from coaching is a really big investment in terms of, you know, your life, how you're thinking about your body and your physical approach, I was like, Leadville to me has always had such a deep and special place in my heart, not just because of this history of the sport where it's our like venue. It's like the venue, right? UTMB is a baby compared to Leadville. Leadville has been there forever, and some of the best athletes ever have gone for this record and failed by hours. And that seemed to me like this amazing big old shot that I could shoot. And even if I didn't get it, it would be such a cool way to structure a year as I ventured into this unknown. And then also Leadville's the most beautiful place in the world. Like you go up there and as far as the eye can see are 14,000 foot mountains, some of the biggest mountains in the United States, all around the race course. And then the race course itself is a mix of trail running that's beautiful and not too steep, mixed with a middle section, a 25-mile middle section of some of the nastiest mountain running you've ever seen, where you have 1,200 feet per mile. So, vertical kilometers, just two of them just stacked in the middle. And everything about it seemed like both a problem and an exciting adventure that needed to be cracked, because this was considered the unbreakable record, the record that maybe no one would get. A lot of articles out there said it was going to be untouched. And historically, that seemed reasonable at the time.
And was it because it had stood for such a long time, or because of what was known about Matt Carpenter and his pedigree, or what was the reason that it was considered unbreakable?
So a combination. One, Matt Carpenter's record at the time was something like a 90-minute course record. And since it's been challenged by the best trail runners, some of the best trail runners out there, and none of them have gotten particularly close. Which I think made a lot of people think, all right, Matt Carpenter, we know based on physiology and his other race results, is one of the best ever. And with Leadville, the year before, in 2004, he had targeted it and had a rough day. Then he dedicated his entire life for the next year to it. And he was so far ahead of his time with the science and the training. And he wrote an amazing post on it, actually, in 2005 after the race that described what he did. And I think people basically thought, well, this is the best ever with a single-minded focus. Who's going to beat him other than maybe one of the other best ever? And so, yeah, I think, and I always thought it was breakable. And I think the question became, was it breakable by somebody like me? Because while I've had some success, I'm not Jim Walmsley or some of the other, I think, best ever. Though maybe this race starts to show that I've had something within me all along that I didn't even let myself conceive of. But I think essentially it just comes down to people have taken shots at this, and every single one kind of has the same flow, which is they're ahead of course record pace until halfway, and then the way back up over Hope Pass, that really nasty mountain, they fall apart. And usually that fall apart is not, oh, they lose it by 10 or 20 minutes. It's, oh, they lose it by 4 or 5 hours. And, so I think it became a problem that people thought, if not unsolvable, would just require someone like Jim Walmsley taking a focus at it. And the sport generally has moved because UTMB's at the same time. Athletes like Jim Walmsley aren't going to Leadville in the last few years, whereas in the previous generation, they did.
Mm. And so, assuming that you don't have a VO2 max of 94.9, what made you think that you said that you weren't sure if you had a shot at it, but at least you thought that it was an interesting question and a task to attempt. So if you were to set the record, which areas did you think were the ones that you could focus on and actually take time out of the previous record, and where was your advantage?
Well, 2005, when he set the record, might as well be 1905 in terms of the history of endurance sports, right? Like when you think about how everything is progressing in terms of the science of training theory, the science of shoes, the science of fueling in particular, fueling being the main one, they were operating in a fully different environment. So I didn't need to beat Matt Carpenter. I needed to beat Matt Carpenter with the benefit of 2 decades of development of endurance training theory. And that gave me just a massive advantage. Like I have no doubts sitting here today that if Matt Carpenter was racing in 2024 with everything we know and how focused on the science he would have beat me, right? But that's not the way history works. This is a one-way march and I'm getting to ride a wave. And because, Megan and I are at the front end of coaching this stuff and we read every single research study that's come out in the last 2 decades, we know basically everything that is worth experimenting with. And, because as an athlete, I'm able to show up every day and try different things. I was confident at the very least that I could give it like the most honest go imaginable. And so even leading up to the race and when I signed up, like if you had made me put a percentage bet on whether I would get it, I would certainly not bet on it. We're talking maybe 5% chance, like even knowing what I know. But in my algebra, I thought a 5% chance at history was so worthwhile because I was only going to get in my entire career. This is my only shot at history, right? This is the only big course record left standing. This is my one shot. And I thought that 5% chance was worth it.
Yeah. So at what point, how far out did you start planning for this? And how far out did you start actually training and preparing specifically for it?
So I registered for the Leadville 50 miler, which I still had to race in. I couldn't just get in. It's not one of those races where as a prominent person, I could just email them. So I did it like everybody else would do. I registered for the 50 miler, paid my $400 or whatever, which that was January 9th. I registered for a July 6th 50 miler and an August 1700. And so right then, basically I train year round in a focused manner and I don't do insanely high volume. So my training doesn't oscillate that much, though it periodizes a lot more based on the type of intensity rather than the background volume. I'm doing very similar things year round in terms of volume. So basically from there, it was just get fast early season, get a little bit more specific on trails as things melt out a little bit in Colorado. We're thinking like May timeframe. And then get very specific right before the race. But one of my big training theories in general is I don't think athletes should hyper focus on specificity, at least for trail running, but also probably for Ironman, because a focus on specificity leaves you going from race to race to race and focus to focus to focus. Whereas, some specificity helps, but what helps way more is just improving your economy at the activity. So if you're a cyclist, improving your FTP is going to help everything, even if you're racing, way below that. And similarly, improving for a runner, improving your velocity at VO2 max is going to improve your 100-mile capability. So even at 36, I'm constantly focused on improving my power output. If we lined up at the start line, I want to know that I would win a 5K at the start of 100. And that's how I want every athlete to think about their training. Like, we all have different skills, but I know for me, the path is via the top end. So background volume stays similar, and then don't get hyper specific until essentially the very end of the process.
I think you've mentioned that, I might have the numbers wrong, but did you say that you want to be in at least a sub 14-minute 5K shape to feel that you had a chance, or was it another number, some 4-minute mile shape, I think?
Yeah.
I heard you mention. Well,
yeah. So it's all a framework of thinking rather than actually doing this, because I've never rode or track raced since I've gotten good. Like, it's not what appeals to me about the sport, but I train like that. And the way that Megan and I thought about it is I needed to be in sub 14 shape at altitude. So, up here in Boulder and above, which is a big thing to say and not do, but I know from coaching where I'm at. And then even more so for me, I come from this American football background. I have a faster twitch like history. I need to think about it from the top end down, because at 36, I'm not the type of athlete that can blunt force aerobic my way to a fast 5K. And that's where thinking about the idea of conceptually being able to run a sub 4 mile at sea level is helpful for me, because that, in running in particular, has this biomechanical stress that basically necessitates that. And I think it makes sense a lot, but we don't often think about it in running. In running, we're always thinking from the bottom up, I think. Whereas in cycling, let's say bike racing, it's a huge emphasis, obviously. Like Tadej Pogacar and Jonas Vingegaard, they need to have massive 4-minute power. In the same way, even though they're training the same, very similar to Iron, and they do incredible Ironman splits. And I think sometimes athletes miss the sight of our floor is defined by our ceiling most of the time, unless we're a natural VO2 freak. And since I'm not a VO2 freak, I need to emphasize that more, because my ability is not VO2 max. My ability could be power at VO2 max. And so everything came back down to running economy rather than, focusing necessarily on the aerobic variables themselves.
And with the focus on economy, how much do you think that differs between trail running, and especially the type of trail running at Leadville with the amount of elevation that you have there, compared to somebody training for a marathon? Because it's how different is that? How much does technical proficiency rather than just getting the miles done play a role?
Yeah, amazing question. I think economy, it matters. It changes a lot in terms of the specificity of it and what matters. So if you're training for a marathon, there's a certain amount of metronomical efficiency that is different, right? Like when I'm thinking economy, I'm thinking I need to be able to run 6-minute pace all day long at altitude. I am not thinking, and that to me also then applies to this 5K, mile, and even marathon type of thinking. But the difference is, if I was trying to apply that same fitness in a marathon and was trying to go for a 2:10, I would need to get so comfortable running just under 5 minutes per mile pace that it's a totally different training approach, right? And the good thing about ultras and Ironman is you don't need to be pushing your physiology in that metronomical manner. This goes for track racing too. Like, having coached athletes at the very top international level in track too, it's almost a stupid human trick at a certain point when you enter the very limits of what you're capable of at run only, like shorter events, that the raw fitness metrics, if we put someone on an uphill treadmill or a technical trail, are not wildly better. But their ability to repeat that in that exact pace is a lot better. And it's usually a type of fitness metric that is fleeting almost. Like, it's the type of thing that you catch lightning in a bottle and you're trying to catch it over and over. Trails, and the reason I love it, and Ironman is probably a lot like this too with the marathon, is it's so much messier. There's so many other variables that get in the way. So you optimize as much as you can, but you're not that worried. I'm never worried about my actual output. I'm worried about the general framework of it and how I'm thinking about it. So, at Leadville, it's like, well, I don't really care if I'm 10 seconds or 20 seconds per mile slower or faster at different points, because it all even out. I mean, there's terribly technical sections at times. There's aid stations. There's all this other stuff. Similarly, in Ironman, those athletes, it matters a little bit at the margins, but for the most part, on the run especially, they're thinking about, how can I run a generally fast time rather than 30 seconds or a minute making all the difference in the world. So, it's helpful, because in trail running, essentially, there are 100 variables to solve for. And I love that. Whereas in the track, maybe there's 3. And the more variables, the better. The more variables there are, the more we can optimize, find different ways to solve an equation, and, exceed what anyone would think possible. And I think before Leadville, if we surveyed knowers in the sport, commentators, things like that, I bet, I'd be curious to know, but I bet a very small fraction of them would say that I had a shot. But what they didn't realize is that, hey, there's 100 variables. And if I've optimized for 95 of them, I might have a shot.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, the more the variables and the more the uncertainty, it equalizes a bit for talent. By that, I mean, talent becomes less important, whereas a more sport like a 5K or a mile on the track is, of course, like you have to train really well and a lot and have a long history in training, but there is a minimum level of talent that is extremely high to reach that. Whereas in a sport like Ironman or trail running, you can get pretty far on a much more average level of talent. Of course, as the sports mature, you need more and more world-class talent to have world-class performances. But these sports are still fairly young in the grand scheme of things. So I think that that is definitely for me as a coach as well something that makes me that why I'm interested in triathlon, because I do think that there is that sort of equalization of talent in a way, to a certain degree anyway.
Yeah, well, there's like an expanding funnel. So at the very bottom of the funnel, like in the 400 meters, 800 meters to the mile or whatever, there's a very limited number of approaches that work at that level. And you can vary it a lot. Like, I mean, there's historically been things like eagle training, which is so different now from Norwegian-based Lydiard style training, but for the most part, there's a few approaches that work. But as we go out farther and farther and these variables become greater, there's so many different approaches that can work. And that's what I love as a coach is finding what works for the individual and knowing that every individual responds so differently. And the longer the distance or the more variables there are, the more opportunities there are to find different ways to solve those n=1. So the way I trained is not the way I train every athlete I coach. It's a sign of, it's not to say that this is even the best way. It's just to say that for my n=1, I've learned over time how to optimize to solve this. And I think that's so exciting in that every one of us with our coaches is figuring out a way to solve these equations, but without complete information. So you have to get comfortable in uncertainty, comfortable in experimentation, and most comfortable of all, understanding how your body feels and interpreting that information, because no amount of data will ever give you the short-term validation of an approach as much as we want it to, because all of this happens over such long time horizons. And as a result, it turns into the coolest science equation mixed with artistic expression. And that's why at the end of the day, I think endurance sports are some of the coolest sports in the whole world. And I say that as a huge sports fan.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. That's very well said. Let's get into the training then. First, let's start with the volume. You mentioned it being quite low volume. Can you discuss a little bit what is your volume normally on a weekly basis, and how is that for how many years? Is it throughout these 18 years that you've been doing similar volume?
So generally 65 to 75 running miles a week, which if you follow ultra training, the types of people that achieve maybe things like this, we're talking 150 miles a week plus in specific phases. And I don't do that. It doesn't fit in the context of my life, but I mix that with a fair amount of cycling and cross training. And I'm not the best cyclist in the world, but I'm good for a runner. And I also focus on building my power on the bike, not just biking for fun, though it is very fun to build your power on the bike. And then uphill treadmill. And so basically this framework for volume, it's not reverse engineered saying, I need to set a course record. What volume do I need? That's not the way I think about it. The way I think about it is more in a day-to-day structure. So in my normal week, I found that it works for me to run 5 days a week with a cross training day and some extra cross training thrown in. And so 65 to 75 essentially comes to, well, on my average everyday run, I can go run 15 or 16 miles and still recover and have a good adaptation process. For a lot of athletes, that's lower. That number might be 6 miles or 12 miles, or they might do a 12-6. I have a young kid. I work a lot. I can't double at this stage of my life really. And because I don't recover off it. So for me, it's like, all right, well, in those 5 days, maybe I'm generally averaging 15 or 16 miles, 75 miles a week, and then having a long run too, which would just be 20-ish. But some of those weeks I'm doing uphill treadmill for that time, and my mileage is low on the uphill treadmill. So that would be the lower end of the spectrum. And then my cycling, I'll do anywhere from a 90-minute or 2 hour Zwift race to a 2.5 hour, 3 hour outdoor ride in Z2. And then occasionally I'll hop on the bike just for fun outside of that. But the volume itself essentially ends up equating to 10 to 13 hours most weeks. And the point not being that I think that's the optimal way to do it. The point being, for my body, that's where, one, it fits in the context of my life. But two, it's how I adapt. And I think athletes lose sight of that, especially in things like Ironman. They're like, more is more and more is better, because the numbers accumulate on Strava. And my point is like, well, if we had an adaptation bar on Strava, that would be a totally different story. And that what I want athletes to quantify is, what are you actually adapting to? Because work without adaptation borders on self-destruction, and it's not sustainable. And since progress does happen over these many year time horizons, endurance sports especially, I want someone to think about, how can I adapt? And that's essentially my entire training framework is an adaptation framework. So, it took me a while to build up my mileage as I worked into running. And then in maybe the mid 2000 teens, like 2013 to 2017 or so, I did higher volume a lot of the time, like 90 to 100 miles. And as I've aged, I've just found I need fewer miles, bigger focus on adaptation. And yeah, leaning into essentially, if I want my economy to be better, I shouldn't practice all the time training feeling like a bag of shit. I need to feel pretty darn good to improve that at this stage of my career.
Yeah, that's a great overview again. Thank you for that. Let's get into some specifics around especially the workouts that you're doing, the harder workouts. Or so if we start with the earlier phase of the periodization, where you focus more on the speed side of the spectrum, what sort of sessions are you doing then to work on that speed?
Yeah, so almost every week I would do some sort of true speed session. Often these are always intervals 3 minutes or under, basically. Around our little neighborhood here in Boulder, our neighbors after Leadville, the number of them that came out of the woodwork to say, we've been watching you all along and we knew you were going to do something special. I just go around our little 1 mile loop over and over again in various fartlicky fashions. I'm not running on pace ever. I'm running on effort, and just usually getting up between 15 and 25 minutes of work, progressing from critical velocity, like 10K type effort, to finish a little bit harder, and then often ending with strides. And that's most of the year. Sometimes those are on shorter hills, like 3 minutes or under hills. And then I always end speed work with steady or moderate running after. This is something that the training philosophy for us has changed over time, primarily motivated by some of the top track coaches in the world, and entering that world a little bit, seeing how often threshold work is tagged after speed or steady running is tagged after speed. I think that was a big piece of progress, where I'll do 2 or 3 miles just at 5:30 pace or 5:45 pace after a speed session. Or, maybe even more focused threshold work, where I'll do, a mile at, 5:10 pace or 5-minute pace. I think that type of work was really helpful. And then do a lot of threshold uphill, because I find that big threshold type sessions aren't as productive for me on flats, because I start to break down and I just can't absorb the quantity of volume needed to spur adaptations. So uphill treadmill is a huge way I did most of them, but then some secondary sessions outside, either in the context of long runs or as a secondary workout, and being very controlled on my threshold. Like, I'm not trying to go faster. And yeah, basically just feeding those variables back and forth with a lot of Z2 training, a lot of Z1 running, and then a fair bit of intensity thresholds type stuff from biking. And then tons and tons of strides. So 3 to 4 days a week of improving my speed via hill strides and flat strides. And so it amounts to about an 80-20 distribution at the end of the week, but I'm not tracking it in a hyper-specific way.
Yeah. So with the fartlek type intervals being based completely on effort, what about the threshold work, whether it's uphill or probably normally uphill? Is that based on effort as well, or is it heart rate combination?
Yeah. So whenever I use lactate strips on myself, it seems like it's dependent on so many outside factors that it takes some of the fun of training away from me. And it's not stable from workout to workout based on how I feel or anything. I'm not sure what that is about. But as a result, especially on uphills, I just decided this is all based on effort. you understand your body at this stage, trust yourself in the same way you trust an athlete. Though I use heart rate as a validation tool after the fact, where I'll go back and look at it. If I'm on the uphill treadmill, I'll make sure I'm actually starting in zone 3 rather than zone 4, so that I don't drift high real quick. But yeah, I think the key thing with almost all athletes is to get a feel for threshold and understand what it feels like, rather than relying on metrics to determine where it's at. Because I think, in true speed, let's say in some of the speed sessions I'm talking about, the fartleks, true fartleks, my main goal is to just go fast. Like, not as fast as I can, but because a lot of the adaptations are mechanical, like, I want to put out power. On the more thresholdy aerobic end of the spectrum stuff, I don't necessarily care how fast I go. And keying into how I feel is so important to ride the line in the appropriate way. So I think letting there be just a little bit more wiggle room in there is super key for my enjoyment, but then I think also for the adaptations.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with that. That's a really good thing to emphasize. And would you say that, so for you then, or when you coach especially, how do you coach athletes to learn how to feel what threshold is? Do you say things like an effort that you could hold for an hour plus minus, or do you say it's an RP of whatever, 6 out of 10? What cues do you use?
Oh my God. I know RPE is backed up in the literature, but I hate RPE as like a quantitative metric. I love it as a feel-based thing. But for me, if someone tells me 6 out of 10, I'm like, a D? I don't know what you're talking about. That doesn't make sense to me. I know I could tune it, but what I like is giving them 1 hour effort cues. And the main thing I like to say is that, especially for elite athletes and advanced athletes in particular, is that threshold is conversational as you're starting it. And then over time, you lose that capability. But it feels much more relaxed than you probably think it should at first when you're doing true threshold style work. And biking is a little bit easier in this regard, because I think, with the power meter, we have basically a true metric with plus or minus bars, but that we can kind of know with more precision. Whereas in running, day-to-day variability for me overpowers any ability to quantify where I'm actually at on a moment. And I also just think, like, it doesn't matter that much for adaptations as long as I'm not pushing the limits of everything. Like, if I go a little too hard, it's fine. If I go a little too easy, even better. And so, I key into the think 1 hour effort, understand what 1 hour effort feels like, and then recalibrate after the fact. Like, if that wasn't 1 hour effort, if you went too hard, note it for next time, learn from that session.
Yeah. And I think that, one thing, I guess a misconception is that some people might think that you get completely different, like the wrong adaptation if you go a little bit too hard. Obviously, that's not the case. It's not like there's not a discrete switch of what happens when you go 5 seconds faster or slower than threshold. But it's more that, can you then back up and do your next planned workout 2 days later? So what happens, the negative impact of going too fast, is simply whether you can recover in time to do the next workout that you have planned, or whatever it might be, a long run, and
absolutely,
not or doing the wrong work.
Totally agree. And I think science, putting it in quotation marks, can be a security blanket for closed-minded people. I'm the ultimate science-oriented coach. My wife's, like, I think, one of the best scientist coaches in the world. But the main thing I think you learn when you get really involved in that is that truly everything is on a spectrum, basically. And we don't know even if we could model 1,000 variables in a perfect flow chart, we would not know the exact things that are leading from stimulus to adaptation. We just don't know that, which is why thinking about it in terms of adaptation framework, like you talked about, how you're feeling after the fact, is probably the best one for most athletes. And you need some calibration for it, but never getting too bogged down in specific numbers, just having the numbers for, validating your feel. Becomes pretty important. And the way that I like to generally think about it is in this adaptation framework. That's why things like uphill treadmill are such a huge part for me, because my 2 key workouts before Leadville threshold sessions was one 12 by 5 minute section and one 20 by 3 minute session. These are not the types of things I give to athletes very often. We're talking super compensation threshold type work. But because I did them on the uphill treadmill, I recovered great. And if I was outside trying to do that same session, one, I would fade by the end because my body wouldn't be as efficient over flat terrain. But two, the chances I come back and am able to back that up with good training is almost zero. And so, what I always think about is like, if something makes me feel like shit, then it is not a positive training adaptation unless it's very specific for the race. So like in trail running, I need to be very specific with being able to run downhills and not have my quads blow up after the fact, especially these steep mountain ones. So it makes sense. You're going to feel like shit after you do that for the first few times. But in terms of my workouts, in terms of my daily runs, in terms of my cycling, it all essentially needs to be supportive. And if it's not, then we got a problem. If it lasts for longer than 24 hours, we got a problem. And that's why double thresholds just weren't going to work for me, because whenever I try them, I spend 3 days recovering. And the whole point of double thresholds is that it's supposed to let you stack more work, not have to do less.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like that's really very much a 50-50. Especially in triathlon, you have the problem of fitting in 3 disciplines. So generally what people try to do is to get two harder swims, 2 harder bikes, 2 harder runs. So you have 6 days of intensity potentially. Well, if you spread them out 1 per day, and you have one school of thought which is to stack them, and one school of thought which is to spread them out. And from everybody I've talked to, I feel like the spread is very much 50-50, and it's probably also very athlete, or it is in my experience, athlete dependent as well. Some respond well to stacking them, and but to be honest, like one thing that I wouldn't do, and I have coached some runners as well, and I've never prescribed a double threshold running day, because I just feel like the risk, the reward for the risk, I just don't feel that's too sensible, really, unless you really have a very long training history of that athlete and know that they have been able to do that without getting any issues and injuries.
And you have a natural ability to recover. Whether that's life context, like you can nap all day and chill and you have a massage therapist, or you're young, or it's your talent. And I think that's one of the big problems is often endurance sports select for the people with the talent of adaptation and recovery for whatever reason. And then we interpolate from those outliers to everybody else, even though the whole thing that makes them outliers is their ability to adapt. And you cannot train that too much, right? Like they're in the same way that you cannot raise your VO2 max to 95, no matter how much you want it. And, I think the benefit triathletes have is that 2 of those activities are non-weight bearing. And so, even as I'm talking about recovery, the main thing I'm talking about is just feeling beat up from running, which is why uphill treadmill is a pretty huge part of my training and why my mileage might look a little lower, because I'm doing some of it on 20% grade. But if I had cycling and swimming as a bigger focus, then I'd definitely be thinking about stacking more work like that, because you're just not beat up. Like any runner out there, or anybody that trains running, I'm sure triathletes feel like this more than even runners sometimes, because you're doing fewer miles, so you're less equipped to handle the mileage, is you just kind of feel sore from running, like especially hard running. And super shoes have helped, which is one thing that I really started to use in the last few years, which is outside of uphill treadmill workouts, like I use super shoes for every workout. I think it's protected my body and allowed me to reverse age. And I think basically if people have the option, you should try to use super shoes for sessions, solely because they clearly help with recovery. And there's a reason that every Olympic runner is using super shoes for every one of their sessions. It's not because it makes you perform better. It's because they help solve this adaptation equation. They come with other issues, right? Like you could get Achilles injuries, foot injuries, other things. But you can wear the shoes way longer. Like I have a pair of Adidas Adios Pro 3s that I've worn for 650 miles that I use on threshold work outside, on roads that, has despite what the marketing says, it still protects my body.
Yeah, no, that's actually really, really cool to hear. I haven't gone that far on any super shoes, but I definitely completely agree with the protective mechanism and how much more quickly you recover with them. So I'm definitely on the same page there. So basically then, to summarize the typical week or the typical sessions within a week there, so you have the faster run, the fartlek, you have the threshold, typically an uphill treadmill session, and you have a bike race on Zwift. Are those, generally speaking, the 3 hard workouts you do in a week? Or
I can just lay out a typical week. So Monday would be a rest or a very easy bike, just pure recovery. Tuesday, easy, longer single and fast strides. Wednesday would be speed workout with steady run finish for the most part. Sometimes being a threshold session on the uphill treadmill when I'm really focusing on the aerobic stimulus of the week rather than speed. So like, especially after you get fast, I find that the true speed, like outside of strides, only needs to be reinforced once every 2 to 4 weeks rather than every week. Particularly with age, you don't want to do too much of that. Thursday would be a bike. Sometimes, especially in winter, Zwift racing. Summer, I'll do longer Z2, which is my body definitely responds way better to the Z2. I just love the Zwift racing. I'm not very good at it, but I love it. Friday would be a longer, easy single or sustained uphill treadmill. Saturday would be a long run, sometimes with the threshold work within it, like to just kind of stack those stresses. Sunday would be, and then Friday would also have strides. Sunday would be an easy run with strides. And strength work concentrated on Sundays, so I can back up into my rest day. Some supportive strength work midweek. But basically rinse and repeat with that over and over and over again. And also throw in, after almost every run I can, when I'm ending at home, I hop on the uphill treadmill for 10 to 15 minutes right after, just to get a little bit more climbing in, because even though we live in Boulder, we don't live in the mountains. So I run a lot of my runs without almost any climbing.
And what about the long run, and especially the long run progression as you get closer to the longer races, to something like Leadville? How long do you go in your long runs, or do you exclusively use races, shorter races, as basically getting those long miles in? How do you think about that?
So at this stage of my career, I don't find much benefit in going super long on long runs. And I think a lot of ultra runners come to this place where when you're in a 100-miler, you're entering the unknown anyway. Like, you're not training for mile 75 by doing a 32-miler. It's just kind of different. You want to train the background attributes, but once you get beyond a certain point, you're just kind of getting tired for no good reason, and you start to get slower. And I don't ever want to get slower. So I think in this build, I did a 20-miler. I do 20 milers pretty consistently, just because sometimes I'll just go, my Tuesday run might become a 20-miler just because I kind of want to on aerobic days. And Coach Megan gives me the authority to do that. And I recover perfectly off easy 20 miles at this stage of my career. That's where the brick stacking of many years comes in. But I did a 25-miler into the 50-mile training race, which was the big stimulus. Probably like a half Ironman would feel for an Ironman athlete, where you get a really big acute stimulus that does a lot of the work for you. Then after that, I essentially just focused on the vert specific requirements. So 3 weeks out, I did a 20-miler or 22-miler with 7,000 feet of climbing and descending. And then 2 weeks out, I did a 20-miler with the same climbing, and then a 27-miler the next day. So long runs were not particularly long for me, primarily because, like, at the end of the day, I just think it comes down to, you need to be the fastest version of yourself that you can be. If you build up the background endurance capabilities so that, you can go on a 15-mile run and not have it break you down pretty consistently, you've kind of maxed out what human endurance looks like from long runs. Like, you just can't do that much. If you go out on a 7-hour long run, there isn't any particularly great adaptation that's happening that isn't also then making you slower and increasing injury risk. It's just such a trade-off. And cycling would be so much different. And the reason I love biking and went on a couple 100-mile rides during the build is that in cycling, you can go out there, do that type of thing, and recover, feel great the next day without almost any injury risk. So, running is just kind of this constant trade-off between endurance stimulus on one side and breakdown risk on the other side, which also coincides with getting slow. So because speed had to be at the forefront, like, I wasn't going to set a Leadville course record. I wasn't going to win Leadville. I wasn't even going to finish Leadville unless I was fast as fuck. So, I just didn't even think that much about long runs outside of this specific training race.
Yeah. I mean, it's basically, you're kind of saying that train for where you are. And by that, I mean that basically doing something like doing consistent 30-mile runs in training, that would just be too much for anybody, for where anybody is, just based on the demands of running. So you just keep consistent 20-milers, 22-milers in there that have that kind of, they are in the sweet spot for the adaptive gains that you get, but without putting you too much into a hole or in a risk zone. so that you're basically building yourself up and then almost let the chips fall where they may on race day. Not exactly like that, but does that make sense in how I think about
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. And, race day is just, you're going easier. And that points out one of my main long run approaches in general is like, on long run, unless you are a world-class athlete who is already a freakish adapter, it is always a workout. It is not a time to think this is a recovery long run. Yeah, like I can go on a 20-mile run and it's like that. But when I'm talking about, that's why I don't even call it a long run in my thinking. Like that's not how I'm thinking of it if I go on a 20-mile run on a Tuesday. When I'm talking about long runs, it's like we're talking quality, not as hard as I can, but tons of Z3, some Z4 on climbs. Sometimes this threshold work we talk about, sometimes tempos within there, always pushing my body so that it's very rare that I finish a long run and I'm like, I want to go do that again. I'm never like, oh, I can go run 100 miles. These are quality stimuli, and I don't want to waste them. That's why I don't almost ever do the classic 2 workouts in a long run. I'm usually doing a workout and a long run that is also a workout. And just it gets back to I can't adapt to that much work. So yeah, I think maybe a big lesson just in general and something from coaching that we've been applying forever is long runs are sessions and treat them as such. Try to feel good for them. Never do them. Like, I don't care about a long run on tired legs. I want to see how you feel on good legs. So try to give yourself good legs as much as you can for those key longer sessions, because that's going to be the types of legs you take on the race day.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. You mentioned strength training there. Can you go into a bit more detail on what that looks like? And what is the importance of that, or what was the importance in the preparation for Leadville?
So I don't do a ton of strength. Like anyone who's followed me knows I'm the king of short little strength routines that I've put online. So all this stuff is free online in terms of what I talk about. But I do a background core routine. So I do band work every day just for my legs before I run. And then core routine we have online that's just called the core snack. It's like 2 minutes long, and I do it 2 or 3 times a day. And I think strong core is something that's been really key for me this year. That's a little different than past years and plays a big role in maintaining form as your body fatigues in practice. Maybe not so much in scientific theory, but then 1 time or 2 times a week, I do a simple routine that involves single leg step ups. We have a lot of videos online of what that looks like, but pretty much a magic exercise that causes no breakdown. Back squats, so just classic squats, 2 sets of 10, back extensions, and single leg calf raises. Like, it is that simple. And it gets back to the same principle we talked about before, that every other time I do the strength work I've been supposed to be doing all these years and do progressive overload, we're talking split squats, deadlifts, all this stuff, I start to get sore and it doesn't get better. So like, yeah, it's fine to be sore when you start a strength program, but if after 3 weeks of that strength program, you're still getting super sore, that's a sign that if we did a blood test of you, your creatine kinase would be through the roof. Your breakdown and inflammation would be high. And it's like, well, I don't want to adapt to strength work. I'm not trying to be better at split squats. I'm going to be better at running. And so I want to be carrying around more freshness day to day. So I found that strength work works for me, and I support athletes doing more. But I just think that like often we overemphasize strength as a stress. And I want to emphasize strength as a supportive mechanism for running to be less stressful. And I think that breaking point for endurance athletes that are training a lot or at all stress limited is much, much sooner than some of the literature would have you believe.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And I think that an athlete is almost kind of, I like it as a coach. If an athlete can get away with not doing any strength training, that's great, because like they can just use all of their resources, time and energy, and all of their fuel that they have to work hard to consume, and to focus on the endurance sport. So some athletes, they have to do more strength training just from an injury prevention perspective, or maybe there is a specific weakness, and for some there may be a decent performance benefit, but it really is across the board. And like the dream scenario for an endurance athlete is that they really don't need to do any strength training, because it's just so much, life is so much easier.
I agree. I think the one difference for me just becomes now at 36, because like I find that I probably need just a little bit more than I might have when I was younger, which was almost none. solely because maybe some of the peak power is starting to go down. And that might be different if I was a cyclist, training that a little more. Also, I think that truly the best strength work any runner can do is a hill stride. Like a 20-second or 30-second fast hill stride, it gets you almost all the real world strength work you could ever need. And I think there's a reason that usually when you talk to athletes at the top level of endurance sports, they're doing very limited strength work or none. And then when you talk to athletes that are like trying to get there, often they do these wild sessions. I think usually it's because somewhere along the way, it's selected out because those wild sessions just leave athletes less capable to do the training they need to actually reach that level in the first place.
Yeah. And what about nutrition and also other aspects of recovery within the training process? And we'll get to nutrition within the race a bit later, but they are probably connected. So let's maybe start with nutrition, and then we can discuss other recovery related aspects.
So my main approach on nutrition is just eat enough always. It is the way to recover and adapt. And thinking of food as essentially adaptation fuel is, I think, one of the big ways that endurance performance has changed, both within training, I think is most important, is trying to do almost all my sessions with full glycogen availability. Not just to make the session better, because often I could at this point in my life run 30 miles pretty quick without fuel and be fine. Because those fat oxidation benefits just happen from training. But mainly to think about adaptation for the next day. We jokingly on our podcast call it food doping, where a lot of the growth we're seeing in endurance sports is just like in the old days, they cheated. Now we eat. Like it's just hugely beneficial for how you adapt and recover. And then in terms of macronutrients outside of that, I try to do pretty high protein intake. So over 100 grams of protein every day, at least. And then outside of that, I don't think about it at all. I eat what I want and I eat food I like. And I wouldn't say my nutrition approach is something like in a specific way, something anyone should model necessarily. It's more of a general approach to food, which is chill, have fun with it. One of the best parts about being an endurance athlete is you're eating a ton of food. Try to make it enjoyable. Don't make it another thing you're trying to control, because I think often the problem with nutrition and the problem with nutrition discussions with professional athletes in particular is that sometimes the type of personality that excels at something like this, astronomical endurance feat is also the type of personality that wants to train 40 hours a week and wants to control every element of nutrition because they're maniacally focused. But I think we're often we're catching confounding variables and calling them drivers. That goes for volume. I think volume alone, you can saturate your adaptation pathways quicker than people assume. It just so happens that the best ever are so motivated that we're catching high volume as a driver. Similarly, I think athletes that have a maniacal focus on their food intake sometimes are just focused in general. And so for me, I probably, if most of our listeners look at my daily nutrition, they'd be like, that guy eats like shit. But I'm like, the reason I'm still going strong at 36 is that framework for me just helps me eat enough. Whereas if I tried to eat exactly what, like quote whole foods every meal or whatever, I wouldn't be the athlete I am.
Yeah, no, it's just difficult, especially when you spend so much time doing training and preparing to train and recovering from training and working and everything like that. Yeah, sometimes you just have to go for the easier options, and it's a hell of a lot better than to not go for the the whole food, the clean eating option, but just getting the calories in basically in the first place, and then secondarily you can think about carbohydrates and proteins and stuff. But as long as you fulfill your calorie need, basically you're 80% of the way there.
Exactly. And that's the thing. It's like, I'd prefer to be 80% of the way there all the time than ever be less than that and have the risks, because a study just came out that I love that had this great pull quote when it surveyed a bunch of elite athletes doing high training, that bone is a nutritionally modulated tissue. Which makes sense, right? There's so much research now that even one day of low carbohydrate availability causes signs of bone issues if you know the biomarkers to look at. Place Megan does a ton of research. But if we could look at every single part of the musculoskeletal system, we would see the same thing, that, soft tissue also is nutritionally modulated tissue, and it happens right away. It happens so fast. So, eating enough primarily has to do around training. Like, you don't want to hit, because that's when you hit the big deficits, right? Like, you can hit huge within day deficits, even if you eat enough across the day within training. But then outside of training, for me, it's just about substrate is substrate. And I want to have fun with food, because if I'm not having fun with food, life itself gets a lot less fun.
So can you give some benchmarks for roughly what you're shooting for in terms of carbohydrate intake per hour for a long run and for a shorter but intense session, and then for a generic single run but not too short, like 13 to 15 miles or so?
I'm generally just around like 60 to 75 grams per hour most of training. I don't feel the need to go super duper high like I do in races. Then the difference there is the quality long runs. When I'm really working a long run or working a bike, I'll push very high. So, for quality runs, I'll do 90 to 120. For quality bikes, I'll try to do as high as I can. Sometimes 150 grams per hour. Like, if I'm on a Zwift race, I'll be like, in this hour, I want to have 600 calories of carbs, and obviously that's very high, but I found that my wattage is directly proportional to my calories consumed. And on my background runs, I just don't want to have to constantly be thinking about it. And like, I don't think you need to. Adaptation wise, I'm not burning any glycogen really on my Z1 runs. So I still consume it because it helps recovery, but it's not something I need. When the intensity gets high, I'll go closer to 75 to 90 on like workouts. Long runs, I'll push 90 to 120. And then, those bikes are actually, I think, in retrospect, a magical place for where I was able to practice what I ended up doing in the race, which is I probably fueled more on race day than anyone's ever fueled before for running 100. And that the ability to do that partially came from, being down in our little pain cave, doing that dumb old Zwift race, slurping like 4 Science and Sport Beta Fuel gels across an hour. With sports drink on top of that, like just astronomical fueling rates that, made it so that my stomach adapted over time.
Yeah. We'll get to that very shortly. But first, other than the nutrition, are there any other aspects of recovery and or adaptation that you think are worth highlighting in your training process?
Yeah. So I use heat a lot. I am a big time proponent of heat training year round. I think that maybe the most powerful adaptation we have is our adaptive response to heat. And the changes in the hematological profile in athletes when they raise their blood volume over time to improve hemoglobin mass is one of the coolest parts of the last 2 years of science that I just think basically every athlete should be trying to do that. So for me, that's hot tub, usually after our baby Leo goes to sleep rather than during specific training. It's passive for me, but definitely helps. Post-exercise ketones, that's a big part of recovery framework for me. I think the research there has been, almost scary how much it seems to prevent non-functional overreaching in studies, even if they don't know the exact mechanism of it, which is always worrisome, but very interesting stuff. So I'll just take a little bit of ketones post-exercise 3 or 4 times a week as well. Massage, I don't have time to go to a massage, but I'll use different massage tools for my legs. And then I also stretch. I know the research on stretching is mixed bag, but as soon as I stop stretching, I get injured. So especially at 36, I'm a tight athlete, do that. And then otherwise, I just, don't think about training as much as I can, focus on parenting and coaching.
Yeah, well, when you're focusing on coaching, I guess you're still thinking about training.
It's true. Yeah, not my own.
Not your own training. And yeah, final question before we get into the actual race discussion, but this is super interesting to hear all of the preparation stuff. But gear, did you have any, what gear are you using even? Because again, a lot of people, me included, are probably not so familiar with gear for different 100-mile races. So is that something that's a big consideration in Leadville what did you end up going for?
So I keep things super simple. Gear wise, I just used a belt. I know in a lot of 100 miles, like you have to wear a vest, you have to do all this stuff. I'm like, well, if you move fast enough, I can just use a waist belt. So I had a double belt. My shorts actually that I'm wearing now to have a built-in belt. And then over top of that, I wore a naked belt. And that combination was just incredibly effective to carry all my nutrition. And I think triathletes definitely have a waist belt. Have a soft flask in the rear of the waist belt it is any athlete I coach that's doing a marathon that doesn't have bottle service now, I have them wear belts, like a naked belt. It is so convenient to have your soft flask there because hydration drives so much of performance. Like so much of what we think is an endurance limitation is a hydration and fueling limitation. And that for me has been game changing. So I just had 2 soft flasks, one in the rear, one in my hand. And it was so convenient to just down, a liter of fluid an hour. And just one of the places where I always thought I had poor fatigue resistance. And I did based on all of our field data that we use. So how is this even possible? I think the big thing is often we confuse natural fatigue resistance for athletes that have a naturally low sweat rate. So that athlete that sweats 12 ounces an hour, it just seems like they can go all day because they don't really need to, they're not worried about playing the dehydration game. An athlete like me that has an astronomically high sweat rate, I need to constantly be taking in fluid on hard efforts, though I don't do that in training. And so that played a big role. And then the other primary thing is just shoes. So trail shoes have just started to make the same leap as road shoes, and they're not there yet, but I use the Adidas Agravix Speed Ultra, not sponsored or anything. They're very unstable. So not for everybody on these types of trails, but for me, I figured out how to lock them down. And I think it's another advantage I had over, the legends of the past is our shoe tech is getting better on trails. It's not 4% for sure. It might just be 0.5% or whatever, but it makes a difference for recovery through the end of the race.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I'll definitely take that advice with the waist belt and the soft flask because it's actually a funny coincidence, but we talked here off air before starting recording about me doing a race, a half distance race a couple of days ago. And I told you about how I'm feeling much better now because I was really focused on my hydration. And it's something that I've noticed in the last little while in my training, being meticulous about measuring my sweat rate in different key training sessions as well, that the ones that go really well where I feel strong to the end, I limit my my fluid loss to maximum 2-3% body weight. And when I get to that 4-5% range, then if I have a session where I start to tire a lot, then I can tell already before I do the post-workout weigh-in that I've definitely lost 4-5% fluid. In a 4-5% body weight in fluid in this session because the performance change indicates such, and so it's something that I've become more attuned to now actually quite recently, and I'll be keen to try that gear tactic with the waist belt and soft flask.
So everything I'm talking about is unsponsored. This is me. Like, how cool is it? It's so rare that an athlete does this, and just we've decided not to. I'm sponsored by the feed, so like generally by food, but not by like a specific company. And I like the Naked Belt. Naked Belt makes a great product and it's so easy. And if you have a soft flask, you can just store it back there and never think about it. And who I think is really pushing the field of hydration forward is Precision Fuel and Hydration. This, company based out of the UK does great work. And the amount that Andy and the team there have emphasized to me that hydration status, particularly via knowing your electrolyte totals, and is tied to recovery. Like, I always was skeptical because the research does not back it up. But then Precision opened up their data vault to me, where they, de-identified data of what they know about athletes. And it's like, clearly the studies are missing something because Precision has a way better data source in terms of all of these case studies, both good and bad. And the amount that performance and adaptation and recovery are linked to those practices in their data is just massive. And like, I trust them fully, and seeing that, which, that data, they started much more in triathlon and cycling than in running, and they've come more to running. But I think one of the reasons we're seeing just a massive push forward in trail running is because of 3 companies, let's say. One, Precision Fuel and Hydration, making hydration much more accessible and understood. 2, at least in the US, the feed, because they're focusing so much on calories, as we'll get into. And then 3, Science and Sport, because the beta fuel gels are absolutely miraculous when it comes to taking in tons of calories. And until I found those, I could never solve the fueling equation. And with those, I'm basically like, it's never a problem for me to have rejection of fuel anymore. which happens in ultras. Like the hard part about taking in 15 hours of fuel for running in particular is that I did this all via gels and sports drink, and the palate gets fatigued and athletes start vomiting in ultras. And, if it weren't for science and sport beta fuel, I'm almost positive this record would not have happened.
It's good that you mentioned science in sport there, because before that, I think a lot of listeners would have thought that I planted an ad for Precision Fuel Hydration before they sponsored this podcast. But
yeah.
but that evens things out a little bit with the science in sport mention.
Oh yeah, no, and precision. So Precision's gels are freaking incredible, and they would also work for me. And I use them. I use basically a mix of those two. But I think for me personally, the science and sports, just because they're 40 grams rather than 30 grams, it's like a bonus 10 grams. And the difference between running and triathlon is the transport becomes a much bigger problem. Like with precision, you could use a flow gel, let's say in a bottle, I imagine, which you could just have a humongous amount of carbs. Whereas I'm just carrying around these little packets, and I want to make sure that it's like, if I can take in fewer packets into my belt, it's easier to transport. So I've been trying to convince the precision guys to come out with a 50-gram gel and make my life easier.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So let's now move into the race. And I guess starting from the race plan, what were your plans going into it in terms of pacing, but also nutrition and hydration planning, in terms of just an overarching view of carbohydrates per hour and fluid volume and so on?
So I think the thing I'm most proud of now in retrospect is, I went for this impossible record or whatever. Yeah, and it might have worked out. But my spreadsheet before the race, I'm not really a spreadsheet guy when it comes to my own racing usually. But in this race, I predicted my time as 15:27, and my actual time was 15:26:34. So something went right when it comes to pacing and spreadsheeting. And basically my theory was that the approach to hundreds, and I imagine to first Ironman, though Ironman's starting to be solved, I think a little bit more, is to respect the distance, right? Like it makes sense to go easier so you have more at the end. And my theory is, no, this is a substrate problem. If I can take in enough fuel, I actually want to push harder. I want to disrespect the distance by respecting my body via fueling and, effort. So I have it really dialed in from training what my zone 2 levels are after a taper at altitude. So I know my general feel. And I was essentially like, I want to push toward the top end of zone 2 and into low zone 3 or even mid zone 3 on climbs throughout the race, as long as I can take in, and this is the key part of this equation, 500 plus calories per hour every hour. And
125 grams in terms of grams.
And even getting up higher than that. So essentially I would be 120 to 140 grams per hour most of the race, though it started to fade at the end as my heart rate also faded. So once my heart rate started going down, which is normal in long ultras, and my effort level started to be mediated by central fatigue factors, I actually took the carbs down so I didn't vomit, because my body wasn't able to use them as fast. And I think if there's more meat on the bone for me, a lot of it's going to come from, if I can keep my heart rate high via limiting those central fatigue factors, I might be able to keep the fueling higher and go faster at the very end. But then it becomes a problem with, rejecting the fuel. But essentially, like, those amounts of fueling also require a pretty high effort level. If you're not also doing a high effort level, there's going to be so much unoxidized, which is fine. Some unoxidized is good. It goes to your brain and it's good for fatigue resistance. But if you're not solving the equation kind of correctly, or at least within the margin of error on that spectrum, you're either going to be vomiting, pooping, or bonking on the other end, right? It's a very tough equation to solve. So I was using just a Coros armband heart rate monitor. Absolutely wonderful tool that also revolutionized my training this year. I hate chest straps personally. It feels like I'm being delicately given the Heimlich maneuver by someone all the time. I don't like them. But the armbands are great. So I was wearing the armband during, and you see armbands on everyone now, even people that aren't sponsored. And there's a reason in running. I'm not sure. Triathlon, I'm sure there's a lot more chest straps still. But I was just periodically glancing at my heart rate when I knew my feel was either I'm going a little too easy or a little too hard. And I would just gently use it as a suggestion for my body. And usually what I found is that I was using heart rate to push harder so that I could feel more and go faster. And so as I was approaching the record and making that spreadsheet, there was a ton of time to gain in the first half of this race. In the second half, all bets are off. I've never done one of these. Matt Carpenter's one of the best ever. Plus, many of the best ultra runners ever have done this race. Like there's a reason that it gets slower at the end. But I knew I could get to 50 miles of this race, running within myself, replacing my fuel, and have a big buffer on the record already. So it was, let's go out and disrespect the distance.
How big a buffer did you have at the halfway point?
So it's a little tough to know exactly, because another fun wrinkle, and one of the reasons people called it an unbreakable record, is that the actual course might be 1.5 to 2.5 miles longer now, because of how they had to loop around at the turnaround. But based on what I understand, it was probably almost my entire buffer. So 15 or 16 minutes was made at the turnaround. And then he came back on me historically because of the added distance there. But almost all of my buffer was made up in that first half.
So yeah, 15, 16 minutes. That's what you broke the record by in the end.
Yeah. 16. Yeah. It ended up being 16 minutes. And not only was it in the first half, most of it was in the first 35 miles of the race. And the reason for that is, like, one, it's very runnable and a place where speed matters. But two, after 36 miles, you go to Hope Pass, which is this really nasty steep climb and descent and climb and descent, the vertical kilometer we talked about. And Matt Carpenter is the best climber who's ever lived. And what's really interesting, actually, as a fun wrinkle historically, is I didn't see his training manual till after the race. But that night, I was writhing in bed, as you do after these long events, and I read it. And he said that he didn't walk a single step of the race. And it was hilarious because that is also the way I approached it. So, like, there are parts of that race that walking would have been as fast or faster. But for me, keying into the fact that I am never going to walk was so helpful emotionally. And so I ran all of that climb, and I don't think I lost much on it because of that. And I think that's one place that maybe my approach also might reshape how elite athletes think about this, is like, there's been such a movement to hiking in this sport. And I think sometimes hiking might be more efficient in a study, but it's definitely not more efficient on the edges of human performance.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I was going to ask as well was, again, related to the fueling with that amount of nutrition. How, and you mentioned that you didn't normally take so much in training. Did you did you feel that you need to do any specific gut training for being able to handle it on race day? Or was the 50 miler you did before, maybe other races, is that enough of gut training for you to be able to handle that on race day in a 100 miler, hopefully?
Absolutely. I needed to double down on gut training, but in a different way. I actually just don't think, I mean, for me personally, I don't enjoy taking 120 grams per hour outside of races. Like, it's very fun in races because it makes you feel great, but doing it all the time to me is just a logistical hassle, and I don't love the feeling. So I'll do it on the bike because it's not a logistical hassle. It's so easy on the bike. But the way I approached it was learning from another sport. So, competitive eating, something I think is mainly in the US, but, we have these things like hot dog eating contests and things like that some famous athletes have done. And I read about how they train because I was like, it's basically the same problem, right? Like, how does your GI system handle this amount of volume without rejecting it? And so for answers to that questions, I looked to the hot dog eaters, and the way they train, there's a couple interesting like studies on this too, is it's all based in fluid and high volume foods. So both fluid and things like watermelon, rather than eating hot dogs as fast as you can. And so what I did in training, and I've done now for a pretty substantial period of time, is sometimes on runs, just my background 15 miler I'll drink all my fluid at once in a run. So I'll drink 48 ounces and it also have electrolytes because I don't want to cause issues and all of that. But I'll drink like 32 to 48 ounces all at once. And, at first you're very uncomfortable after, and over time you just don't notice a bloat at all. Or I'll take 2 or 3 Science and Sport Beta Fuel gels all at once. Or maybe the best option of all is a precision 90-gram gel. So like they make these, we call them big ash gels, and just take all of it at once and then do the hydration protocol. And training my stomach to deal with that quantity of just shit in it, I think was way more important than the times I took 120 in practice. And I think if anything, that might be another place I push the field forward a little bit, is thinking about, this isn't just a question of training the oxidation rates. I think the oxidation rates, I think that happens fast. I think, like you said, one race, a few efforts on the bike, you're probably good to go. I think the hard part becomes the bloating and GI distress end of the equation. And because cell lines in the GI system turn over really fast, which is great, obviously, evolutionarily, but it's also great for adapting this stuff. There can be epigenetic signaling patterns that then get trained into subsequent cell lines. So I noticed a fundamental difference within a week or two. And by the time now, like, I can stuff a ton into my stomach. So even though I'm not a huge person, I think I probably have the stomach of, someone that has been eating tons of hot dogs in competition his entire life.
You didn't by any chance look into how beer mile athletes train?
Yeah.
There could be something there as well.
Fascinating. I didn't think about that, but probably very similar, right? Like a beer mile or something like that is such a humongous gut stress. And if there was a way to repeat it outside of taking in the alcohol in a mile, like, exactly. Great point. I love it.
We need to check this.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think in general, that point of especially the fluid, I think the ounces converts to 1 to 1.5 liters for metric listeners. But so yeah, that's a huge amount to take in one go. And yeah, I've never thought of that or heard that before hearing about you doing it now just recently. So that was definitely a learning. And I can't imagine too many people have practiced that before. So
I would say just
for sure.
Be careful because, like, obviously if that's just water, that can be risky for, like diminished electrolyte content and stuff. So, I always say do it with electrolytes if you're going to do it, but don't also just be careful and start low and then go up. But often I did it with water. So do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. And you mentioned running in at zone 2 heart rate or having that as a target. So was that zone 2 heart rate, how was that established? Is it based on what you feel is zone 2, or do you do specific testing to establish it, or how do you come up with that target?
So I love the work Joe Friel has done on heart rate, because I think a lot of the times establishing your heart rate zones via lab test or lactate test is unreliable day to day, because too many variables start to come in, and having done a ton of lactate testing, and it just doesn't work for me. Like the approach starts to get so noisy that I can't get close enough to what I actually need to know on a given day after a taper at altitude, whatever. So, the way Joe Friel approaches heart rate via estimating your zones from lactate threshold is a version of that is what we do. So I've done that for thousands of people that listen to our podcast. So, hey, if you're out there, listen to our podcast, but then you can email me, and if you give me a hard workout file, I'll use that hard workout file to give you a general estimate of your 5 zones. And the cool thing is, subsequently, we've had tons of athletes either do lactate testing or do lab testing. And I can usually get within a couple beats of the aerobic threshold just from any hard workout file, because you get pretty good at seeing where the differences lie. So it's just a basic try to find where their LT is, their LT2, their true 1 hour effort threshold. And then, from there, interpolate where their zones are. It becomes a little bit of a still feel-based mechanism, but it's more able to be flowy from day to day. So the reason that I could apply that in the race is I know where I'm at with my LT heart rate on tired legs here in Boulder. I know where I'm at on fresh legs here in Boulder. I also know where I'm at on tapered legs at 10,000 feet. And those are all different numbers within a certain range, because, at altitude, your LT can be diminished, but then simultaneously, after a taper, heart rate can get jumpy as fuck. And so because of that, I generally knew within a few beats where I should be, which is all I really care about, because again, it goes back to the spectrum thing. Like, I could take in a really strong cup of coffee and my heart rate's totally changing from that. And so understanding that, to be adaptable via the spectrum is pretty key. So I like just using lactate threshold to calculate zones, other methods to do it too, but classic 5-zone model calculations. And I've written articles on that called How to Calculate Your Heart Rate Zones that are public on Trail Runner magazine. And it gets into how people could do it themselves if they don't want to send me a hard workout file.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, especially when you really know your own body and how it responds to training, you have all the data. I would, if I give general advice, I would actually advise something different and base it on max heart rate, because I think that when you're estimating your lactate threshold heart rate from, let's say, a race file or a workout file, you're already doing the first estimate, and then you're taking the other zones or the aerobic, the lactate threshold 1 from the second threshold. So you're basically taking an estimate of an estimate, and you get that kind of propagation of error. So I would rather an athlete does a full-on 5K or something, or an all-out workout where you know that they reach close to max heart rate, and then based on max heart rate, you're taking estimates from that, of course, to find the different zones and different thresholds, but it's only one estimate there. So that would be my generic advice. But that's
I love it. I think endurance athletes are terrible at hitting their max heart rate in general. Having coached short distance athletes and seeing what true max heart rate looks like across the spectrum. So I would say we should have a competition to see, validate it with lab tests, see who gets closer. But no, I think all of it, like you pointed out, just comes back to feel. Like if it's not calibrated to your feel, it's useless, and it's not going to be correct either. So what I always like when I'm coaching an athlete, so like when I'm calculating it for someone that's a podcast listener, I'll just say, hey, here's an estimate of your zones. You're the best. When it's an athlete I coach, I'm like, let's really dial in. Okay, at the top end of zone 2, is that what it actually feels like? And how, like, does that seem right? And usually what happens is athletes are like, oh my God, this is eye-opening. I had no idea. I have a high LTHR. That zone 2 makes so much more sense than what my watch has been telling me and whatever. But sometimes athletes might be like, I don't know. And that to me is more of a powerful driver than how we're calculating it.
Yeah, everything comes down to feel, for sure. I mean, even I'm actually impressed now thinking about it by your heart rate monitor that it has enough battery for 15 hours, 26 minutes, because I'm using the Polar ARM-based armband, and I don't think that one has that long battery. It's just about enough for a 9-hour effort, but I don't think that it would go much longer than that.
Guess what's crazy? This not only did this thing last the race, I didn't charge it for the couple weeks after. Continued to last. I don't actually know how long their battery life is. But yeah, I was blown away too. I kind of expected both my watch and my monitor to die, and both went strong. And my watch is just a normal Garmin. I'm flashing up to the screen right now. Nothing special.
Yeah, and I guess that's where for ultra runners, especially if they are not as fast as you, they might be out there for 20 hours or more, then it becomes even more important. Like, your equipment is potentially going to run out of battery. You just have to be able to pace by feel. I mean, it even happened to me just the other day in that race that I did, that my bike computer, somehow the bolts for the bike mount came loose. So I didn't lose my bike computer, but it got loose, and I had to not lose it. I had to put it in my tri-suit after halfway through the bike. So I was riding blind for more than half of the bike, basically, and didn't have any numbers to go by.
In practice,
it kept recording, and speed and power was basically the same, both halves. So I was quite happy with that.
And in practice, like, I only use this stuff to help me understand the 100-mile distance when I was entering the unknown, right? And trying this thing that seemed impossible. But once it became race time, when we started hitting Hope Pass and things like that, I never looked at my heart rate. I was using this to give me almost as a security blanket to let me know that I was okay, that I could push like that. Rather than telling me anything that I didn't already know on some level. And so basically I was like, all right, now it's race time. And when it's race time, you got to leave space for breakthroughs. Breakthroughs are not happening on a watch. Breakthroughs are happening by betting on yourself and shooting a shot. And, as a result, I didn't, even though I knew, like, I predicted my finish time almost exactly, I never once was aware of splits during the race. I didn't care. I was like, all I can do is what I got, and I'm going to give it my best shot. And I don't care what my actual split is, because I'm trying to solve a really hard to solve equation. And so much of that is essentially a mental process to take the leap, to bet on a breakthrough.
I think that in itself is a great learning that we can all draw from this discussion, that when you're really shooting for something big, then you have to be very, very prepared to fail. You said that you thought that you had maybe a 5% chance of actually doing it, of actually setting the course record. So you basically thought that you had a 95% certainty of failing and not being able to follow your plan.
Yeah.
And so I guess that that's something that we can all, whatever the level, whatever the goal is, anybody can look at that and say, well, maybe my goal is completely different, but it's something that is big and scary to me. But maybe I just have to go for it and see what happens. And of course, you mentioned all of the kind of due diligence that went into all of your knowledge and all of your preparation. But still, like there's also that acknowledgement of uncertainty, that you don't know what's going to happen, and you just, at the end of the day, if you want to try, you have to give it a shot, and you have to not know what the outcome is going to be. Because if you know what the outcome is going to be, then that's not a big goal. That's a soft goal. That is something that you know already that is going to happen.
Yeah. Well, I think it gets back to the whole point of endurance sports and why they're so magical for everybody, no matter what your level is and what your goals are, is that this success rested on not just 18 years of brick stacking, but so many failures and so many shots that I took along the way, some of which went in, some of which didn't. But I'm most thankful for the ones that didn't, because I think so often success in these sports is so blatantly obvious from when an athlete is young and it's available right away. And I hope what I represent to some people is that talent comes in a lot of different ways. And those different ways just require showing up, giving yourself a shot, and betting on yourself over and over and over again. And the cool thing about endurance sports is it's not like your chips get taken away. If you bet on yourself, you're given more chips even when you fail. And so, yeah, I've DNF'd over and over again. I've had great races, and I've won a couple short distance 10K national championships on the trails, but I've also eaten shit in really public ways. And I've gotten hate online for it. Like there's a whole group of people that freaking hate me out there, and I don't even know why. And they're going to respond with hate no matter what I do. But most importantly, the people that actually care about me, the people that love me, which is so cool that we have this great community via the podcast, and the endurance world is such an amazing place in general, that those people, when I fail, are going to respond with even more love. And so I think for me, it took 18 years of aerobic bricks and endurance building to make this possible. But more than that still, it required 18 years of failing to the point that I understood I was enough no matter what. So I could go out there as the man with nothing to lose. And as soon as I was able to run fearlessly and truly unburden myself of expectations, of narratives, of even concerns about the course record, like I never thought about it when I was out there. As soon as I could do that, something that was impossible became possible. And so I think for everybody, it's just keep showing up, keep betting on yourself, and then apply that to everything you do in life. Like, yeah, it's often not going to lead to the great outcome, but the whole point is that it's not about the outcome. It's about the process you took to get there and the type of person that you find after the finish line, whether it's a good day or a bad one.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Very, very well said. And I think that mindset that you referenced about having nothing to lose, psychologically speaking, like that's, I recognize it when you say it. I've never phrased it like that or thought about it like that, but I definitely, I know exactly what you're saying. And it's a psychological state when you're on the start line that I completely agree that that's where magic can happen when you have that sense of safety in yourself, that no matter what happens, it's not the end of the world, so you don't have anything to lose.
Yeah, and you can eventually learn to celebrate it no matter what. I mean, that's the whole theme of my coaching, is that, look, we all die. The only real finish line is death. And in that framework, like everybody is going through the same struggles. In a general sense that applies about like existence, right? Like all humans have the same anxieties for the most part and concerns. Even people you hate are dealing with the same uncertainty and impermanence. But athletically, we're all feeling the same chemical reactions, which is why I love the science of it, right? Like every single person, someone that's running a 1 hour 5K is feeling the same things as someone that's running a 12:30 5K, like going for a world record. It's like that unites us all. And so, when you really lean into the idea that like athletics is an ability to express yourself and experience life without any real risk. Like at the end of the day, there is no risk waiting on the other end for you. It can make it so fun. It's like the coolest sport. You get a chance to be an athlete till you're freaking 90 years old if you want to, explore your physical nature, and get to experience 1,000 little deaths before your real, screen test for true death. It's like, what in a wild way to gain wisdom and learn about the world in ways that non-athletes and people that aren't pushing their bodies that way never will. And so, yeah, I showed up in the start line as 36, but I think I'm essentially an elder, like a village elder when it comes to understanding existence. And all of that is owed to the power of endurance sports and the same feelings that literally everybody who's ever tried to run a mile feels.
Yeah, no, wow, that's a very, very good perspective. We're running out of time. I want to.
Yeah.
There's so much more that we could talk about. Actually, I have a long list of questions that we haven't gotten to, and as I said before, into even beyond this list of questions, I have many other questions in my head. let's just hit a couple more of these last batch of questions.
We can do quick hitters.
Quick hitters from the general and reflective session. So first of all, what is something you've changed your mind about in terms of training or performance, and something that you approach differently now than you used to?
I'm gonna try to talk about things I haven't talked about yet. What I've changed my mind about: sodium bicarbonate. I was a skeptic years ago, even though I saw the studies for years. And then coaching elite level track runners, have seen the ubiquity behind the scenes. Athletes don't talk about it, but we're probably saying 90% adoption rates at the elite end of track and field for morphin bicarbonate. And I started to experiment with it myself, because I wanted to understand how my track athletes would feel, to just truly understand, and noticed a massive endurance improvement. Very immediately obvious via performance. Also saw a decrease to a total zeroing out of my cramping history. I used to be a cramper. So I don't know, right? Like there's not any study on over an hour in duration. Up to an hour, there are performance improvements for sure for cyclists. I bet 10 years from now, we're going to see that this stuff is an ultra performance enhancer and we don't know why. So sodium bicarbonate, just baking soda for the listeners. Martin figured out a way to encapsulate it. It's a place where I have changed my mind. And not only have I changed my mind, I think that what we're seeing in endurance sports is largely bicarbonate driven. I mean, obviously fueling driven much more, but I think the role of sodium bicarbonate is being missed by a lot of people that aren't truly talking to the best in the world behind the scenes, because often people are not being fully honest about what they're actually doing.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. And what do you think are the most common mistakes made by endurance athletes?
Underfueling training. It took me a while to learn that process, especially athletes that are worried about body composition. They underfuel, enter within day energy deficits. Their resting metabolic rate goes down. They counterintuitively get less productive body composition changes because they're not fueling and they're not adapting and they're performing worse. But even short of that, it is our opportunity to become superhuman, and fueling unlocks endurance. So, the more calories you can take in during training to a certain point, the better you're going to perform. And the better you're going to perform, the better you're going to adapt.
If you could go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice, what would you say to yourself as an athlete and as a coach? So it's actually two pieces of advice.
So as an athlete, keep showing up. You have something within you that you don't understand, and talent looks a lot different on different people. And so don't expect somebody else's talent to shine to indicate you have talent. The only way you're going to find out is if you stack up bricks for yourself for 18 years to find out that you had something within you all along that you never could have expected. So keep betting on yourself. And no matter how that goes, even if it's not, a record or whatever, it's a worthwhile journey. So just keep showing up, keep betting on a talent that you can't foresee. And then as a coach, keep your head down. I think learning from other coaches has been maybe my biggest skill. I'm aggressively open-minded. I'm always trying to figure out what other people are doing, talking to them, understanding how it incorporates into broader training theory, and developing my own training theory accordingly. But I think in the process, I was hyper aware for a long time about what people were saying about me as a prominent coach. Because I'd be tagged and stuff and I'd be like, I don't want to know this. I don't want to. And I think it's just the nature of contrasting ideas is sometimes people take contrasting ideas as personal attacks, whereas I've never felt that way about the world. So I want people to view the world differently because that's how evolution of ideas happens, and diversity is a great thing. And I think especially early in my coaching career, I was aware of the criticism in ways that made me self-conscious that in an unproductive manner for myself, for my like own happiness. And now I think I'm much more comfortable with, the comments are going to be what the comments are going to be. Just try to keep giving people love, and whatever comes of that will be a good thing.
And 2 more quick hitters. What is the best or most influential book that you have read?
Okay. Non-training, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It taught me, I read it when I was a very young kid, probably like 7 years old. And I've read it many times since. And it just taught me it was okay to be silly. And it's okay to find joy in the things you find joy in. To laugh in the face of adversity, or to cry in the face of joy. Basically, whatever. It allowed me to understand that what expression looks like can be so different than it might feel if you're expecting a certain thing of yourself. So, such a hilarious book, and it truly just gave me permission to embrace like seeing the cosmic joke, like the broader joke of existence. And understanding that cosmic joke is what I think liberated me to take big risks in life. Because, you get one shot at life. And at the end of the day, like, no matter how it goes exactly, you can still find the humor and your big old towel for when you're panicking.
And just a final question. What are the 1 to 3 best pieces of coaching advice that you've ever received?
So, best piece of coaching advice by Siri Lindley, triathlon coach. And she met us in 2017 or something. So I was a prominent coach by then, but not like now. And she said something along the lines of, be authentic, be authentic, be authentic, be the bad guy, be authentic. Like, essentially coming back to that word authenticity and giving me permission within the context of that to not just be loving and uplifting unconditionally all the time when other things are needed. So Siri Lindley's message, she's an amazing triathlon coach, an amazing person, and her message of authenticity has been incredibly meaningful to me in a professional sense. Like, I'm very good at being authentic personally. Professionally, I'm always worried about letting people down. And she let me know that sometimes your role as a coach is to let people down in an authentic way. And so she, I think, unlocked everything that came after it as a coach.
Yeah, no, that's great. A great note to end on. Well, before we end though, tell people where they can follow you. You have a podcast. I just started listening to a couple of episodes actually, and I really enjoyed them. So I'll tune in for a few more, I think. Tell us where we can follow you.
Yeah, so Some Work All Play podcast. It's an acquired taste. Don't give us a bad review if you're not about our humor. But it's we delve into all of the nooks and crannies of training theory. Also make tons of jokes. It's our Megan and I's ability to have a lot of fun, and it's one of the top running podcasts in the world. Then otherwise, my stuff is all over the internet. If there's ever a way I can help one of your listeners, just reach out to me and ask a question. Like, we're full for coaching, but I spend a lot of time each day just answering questions to try to help people out. So always here. Nothing's too big or too small. Life, training, whatever. Most of all, love you all. Just so proud of you. If you got through this whole interview, you have amazing endurance, because I talked a lot. But it's just so, the triathlon community is amazing. Like, I love how athletes are pushing the limits of training theory. And one thing we didn't get into that maybe we can do a follow-up podcast eventually is how much of my approach to training theory has actually been derived from triathlon and Ironman training specifically. Because I think Ironman is testing the margins of so many different endurance questions that, much like cycling, we have this amazing uncontrolled experiment going on. So let's embrace a lot of science, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of fun.
Absolutely. No, there's definitely room for a follow-up, because we left a lot off from this interview. But I'm keen to do one at a later point. So looking forward to that. Thank you so much.
Perfect. You're amazing. Great job. You're such a freaking awesome interviewer. And I can't wait I'm going to become like such a religious listener right now. I've gotten so many people sending me links to your podcast over time. And so I've listened to some of the coaching episodes, but like, I need to go all in. I can't wait.
Don't go too far back.
Same on ours. Have a great day.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com with links to David's website and Instagram and podcast. And definitely, if you're interested in even more details about his race, then I listened to a few episodes that he did with his wife Megan on their podcast about that the race and the training and everything. And I think that they have a lot of additional useful details that they go through. So that's something that I can recommend checking out if this stuff interests you. One of the main takeaways that I would take personally from this episode is David's commitment to being in great 5K shape for a 100-mile race, or just in general, maintaining a good and high top end. I think this sets a really good example for avoiding what I think is a very common mistake in triathlon training, or at least in Ironman training, which is you see very often people doing a ton of low to moderate intensity training, but completely neglecting higher intensities. I'm not talking true speed, but things like, in running terms, 10K, 5K pace, potentially a little faster than 5K pace. And then over time, basically getting slower, or at least not getting faster, because their ceiling is too limited, essentially. So even though we're talking about ultra endurance events, your ceiling is always going to set a certain limit on you. And granted, depending on the athlete's physiological profile, David is more of a faster, powerful athlete in terms of his physiological profile, from what I understand, with a American football background. But so depending on the athlete profile, you might need very little of this type of training, or a moderate, or even a fairly large amount. It's not as if everybody needs to do this training on a weekly basis, in my opinion. And it is basically a question of periodization as well. But as a practical takeaway, especially for athletes that tend to go from one long race or event to another, I would just say don't fall into the common trap of constantly doing race specificity, where the race is done at a fairly low intensity, because that probably will limit your potential, as you will gradually be blunting your top end too much. So think about how you can make sure that you maintain or even improve your top end, whether it is by sprinkling in training at higher intensities regularly, or by focusing more on it in certain periods within a macro cycle of training. Now, a little bit of marketing of our training camps before we finish this episode. So we have 2 training camps scheduled for 2025, and they are both open for registration, and we already have quite a few registrations already. We have Mallorca from the 5th to the 12th of April, and the Algarve, Portugal, from the 26th of April to the 3rd of May. I think an interesting observation that I have so far with the registrations that we have for these 2 camps is that 80 to 90% of the registrations are from people who have been on at least one of our training camps in the past, and many of these have been to 2 or more camps. So it's actually something that I'm really, really proud of, as it shows that it's a product, if you want to call it that people really like when they go to the level of taking a week out of the time to come back on a 2nd, 3rd, or even 4th training camp with us. So if you have not been to one of our camps before, fear not though, because it is an extremely welcoming environment towards everybody, newcomers and returning participants alike. And there are, of course, lots of different triathlon camps that you could go to, but one of the really unique things about our camps is the fact that it is a very international group of participants. It's not a camp that you go to and everybody else is from your own country, and it's also not a camp that you go to but everybody else is from the same country and you are the odd one out, not being from that country. It's just a great mix of people from different countries, different continents even. Usually the majority of participants are from Europe and North America, but we do have some participants from South America and Australasia that have come to our camps. So from very far away, considering that our camps so far at least have been in Europe. And it's something that a lot of participants find is one of the best things about the camp, just how it's so diverse, basically, in terms of the participants. And this also goes for the genders and ages and so on. It's a very diverse and inclusive camp. I also want to make a short note about some differences that we have between the Portugal and Mallorca training camps. The main one is size. For Mallorca, we usually have 30 to 35 participants, and that's about the limit, 35 or so. For Portugal, we will limit the size to 16 only. So it is more of a small group camp, a bit more intimate. And we will also, of course, consequently have a lot more or a bit more manpower on the Mallorca camp. So for this reason, the fitness level needed for the Portugal camp will be a little bit higher. However, don't let that intimidate you. We are still talking about a camp with very normal age group triathletes. It's not in any way some kind of elite camp. Other than that difference, or those differences, accommodation-wise, in Mallorca we stay at a big resort, a very nice resort. In Portugal, it is a normal hotel, again, a very nice hotel, but a bit of a different feel with a resort compared to a hotel. But in both cases, breakfast and dinner is included. If you're looking for spectacular cycling, then Mallorca is, without a doubt, the one to go for, because it is truly spectacular. But I personally also really rate the cycling in the Algarve very highly, because you get treated to almost completely traffic-free roads in among beautiful rolling hills. And that feeling of having it all to yourself is quite amazing, and something you don't have in a place like Mallorca with so many other cyclists and cars, although the car traffic there is very nice. They are very respectful. But the difference being that in the Algarve, it's all very quiet and you're very alone out there in the hills, in the hinterland. So it's a different feel, not as stunning, but very, very enjoyable and very good cycling. I will be at both camps personally, in case anybody's wondering about that. And if you have any questions about any of the camps or want to discuss which one might be better for you, then please get in touch and I am more than happy to help. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. If you're looking for high quality, practical and tasty fueling and hydration products, make sure to try Precision Fuel and Hydration. There are a range of options from drink mix to gels to chews, so you can easily find your personal favorite. And don't forget to take 15% off your first order with the code TTS24. And thank you to Senate. The Senate Swim Trainer is a great tool to have in your toolbox to improve your technique and power, to target specific aspects of your stroke, and to maintain consistency when you don't have time to get to the pool. You can try the Senate risk-free for up to 30 days and get 20% off your first order on senateswimtrainer.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.